In the early 13th century, from the windswept steppes of Central Asia emerged a name that would haunt civilizations from China to Europe: Genghis Khan. He rode at the head of an unstoppable force, an army of horsemen, archers, engineers, and assassins. They moved like shadows and struck like fire. Cities fell, empires crumbled, and entire cultures vanished. But it wasn't just military brilliance or overwhelming numbers that allowed Genghis Khan to forge the largest contiguous empire in human history. It was something more elemental: fear. Not just the fear of death, but of something far worse: torture. From Persia to the Caucasus, from the Jin dynasty to the gates of Hungary, stories spread like wildfire. Stories of nobles crushed beneath wooden boards, of kings suffocated with felt rugs, of soldiers burned alive, and of civilians buried up to their necks and left for the elements. Tales told of pyramids made from severed heads, and of entire populations marched into the desert to die slowly, one breath at a time. These were not the wild excesses of undisciplined men. They were deliberate tactics, directed from the top, part of a vast system of psychological warfare designed to shatter resistance before the first arrow was loosed. When Genghis Khan took a city, it wasn't just a victory, it was a message. Those who defied him would not simply die. They would be broken, humiliated, and erased. Resistance would be punished not with death alone, but with suffering so profound that it would echo for generations. He understood something timeless: that in war, fear travels faster than armies. And when fear works, blood need not be spilled, because the enemy destroys itself. Modern historians often debate the brutality of Genghis Khan. Was he a product of his time? Was his cruelty exaggerated by enemies, or was he, as many chronicles claim, a ruler who used torture not as a last resort, but as a weapon of statecraft? Whatever the truth, the legacy remains. To this day, in the ruins of once great cities, Nishapur, Merv, Samarkand, bones still surface from mass graves. In ancient manuscripts, scribes recorded the cries of survivors and the silence left behind by those who did not. In folklore, his name still carries weight, not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of merciless vengeance. This is not the story of battlefield tactics or empire building. This is the story of what came after the walls fell, of the men, women, and rulers who were tortured not merely to die, but to serve as examples, of the methods used to cripple enemy morale, to extract confessions, or simply to send a message no one could forget. This is the story of Genghis Khan's most terrifying torture methods, where death was not the end, but the proof of power. Before the name Genghis Khan became a weapon in itself, he was simply Temujin, a boy born into a world of betrayal, violence, and survival. Born around 1162 on the harsh Mongolian steppes, Temujin entered life amid tribal warfare and blood feuds. His father, a chieftain, was poisoned by a rival clan when Temujin was just 9 years old. Overnight, his family became outcasts. Left to starve, hunted by former allies, they survived by eating roots, rodents, and occasionally their own horses. There was no safety, no mercy. It was in this crucible that Temujin learned his first lessons in pain and power. At the age of 15, he was captured by the Taichi Ud, a rival Mongol tribe. They bound him with a wooden collar, a brutal device that prevented sleep, movement, or rest. He was humiliated, paraded like livestock. The young Temujin endured the torment in silence, but the memory never left him. When he escaped, he vowed never to be powerless again. That vow became prophecy. As Temujin grew into a warrior, he discovered that loyalty was fluid, but fear was absolute. He began consolidating tribes not just through diplomacy, but through carefully calculated brutality. Those who allied with him were rewarded generously. Those who resisted were tortured publicly, not to inflict pain alone, but to send a message to all who watched. When the Merkits, the tribe responsible for kidnapping his young wife Berta, refused to surrender, Temujin's forces crushed them. Survivors were enslaved or mutilated. The leaders were executed in full view of their people, boiled alive, burned slowly, or dismembered, depending on what lesson Temujin wanted to teach that day. The message was clear: defiance would not be tolerated. As his reputation grew, Temujin understood something deeper. Terror was more effective than generosity. A well-fed soldier could still turn on you, but a terrified one would obey until death. He began refining cruelty into policy, using torture as both punishment and performance. Victories were accompanied by ritual humiliation of enemy chiefs, slow executions, and mass displays of suffering. Temujin's enemies didn't just lose. They were erased, often buried alive, crushed beneath the hooves of horses, or beheaded one by one, with their skulls stacked at city gates. In 1206, after years of conquest and calculated terror, the Mongol tribes met on the Onon River and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. By then, he had not just united a fractured land, he had reshaped Mongol identity around a single principle: obedience through fear. From that moment forward, torture was no longer a tool of revenge or justice. It was statecraft, a language spoken by flame, rope, and blade. And Genghis Khan would speak it fluently. He carried the memory of his own humiliation like a blade beneath his skin, and he would wield it against a world that once tried to break him. What began in a wooden collar would end in a mountain of skulls. Genghis Khan did not rule through chaos. He ruled through order, sharpened by terror. Beneath the outward savagery of Mongol conquest lay a highly structured legal code known as the Yasa. Though the exact contents were never written down officially and varied over time, the Yasa was a fusion of tribal custom, military discipline, and the iron will of a single man. It governed everything from how to treat an enemy, to how to distribute loot, to how to punish betrayal. And always at the heart of it was one principle: loyalty above all else. Disobedience to the Khan was not merely treason, it was blasphemy. The Mongol world was not built on rights, but on obedience to power, and justice was not blind. It watched carefully and struck hard. Torture in this system was not chaos, it was policy. Stealing a horse could result in being dragged behind one. Lying could lead to the removal of the tongue. A soldier who fled battle might be executed alongside his entire family to erase the bloodline of cowardice. For enemies of the empire, punishment was even more severe. Captured spies were flayed alive, their skin hung from city gates. Defectors were boiled or executed slowly by impalement. And in a chilling display of Genghis Khan's methodical cruelty, entire enemy royal families were sometimes buried alive or bricked into towers, left to die in darkness and silence. But even within this brutality, there was a kind of logic. Genghis Khan believed that by punishing one man brutally, he could spare the lives of 1,000 others. He used torture not randomly, but with surgical precision, choosing his victims to maximize fear, ensure obedience, and eliminate future threats. His soldiers were bound by strict discipline. Plundering without permission, mistreating civilians unnecessarily, or lying to superiors were crimes punishable by death. And that punishment was not discreet. It was public, ritualized, and meant to scar the memory of all who witnessed it. In this way, Mongol justice became something far more terrifying than law. It became a theater of pain, a warning performed in blood and fire. And like all great performances, it had a very specific audience, the next city in the Mongols' path. They knew what was coming. They had heard the stories. and many surrendered without a single arrow being fired. When Genghis Khan laid siege to a city, the assault often began before the first arrow was loosed. It began with reputation. Word traveled faster than horses, stories of cities that defied the Mongols and were wiped from the map, of commanders who were executed slowly in front of their armies, of mass graves so vast they altered the landscape. Before the first catapult was loaded, many cities had already begun to crumble under the weight of what was coming. This was not accidental. Genghis Khan understood a timeless truth: fear is more efficient than force, and fear, to be truly effective, must be performative. It must be seen, heard, and passed on, from one trembling survivor to the next potential victim. Torture, under Genghis Khan, became theatre. When the city of Nishapur in modern-day Iran resisted Mongol rule in 1221, the consequences were not swift, they were orchestrated. After Mongol general Tokuchar, the Khan's son-in-law, was killed during the siege, Genghis Khan responded with something more than vengeance. He ordered the city emptied and its citizens, men, women, and children, executed. But it wasn't just killing, it was messaging. The Mongols piled the skulls of the dead into giant pyramids, arranged at the gates of the ruins. Some estimates suggest up to 100,000 were slaughtered, their bones stacked as high as houses. It was a macabre monument that no diplomat or merchant could ignore. Travelers who passed through the city afterward spread the story like a virus, carrying fear into every corner of the Islamic world. The Mongols didn't hide their atrocities, they displayed them. In Urgench, in present-day Turkmenistan, after a lengthy siege, captured soldiers were executed in a calculated fashion. Each Mongol warrior was assigned to kill 24 prisoners. The executions took hours. The message took seconds. And it wasn't always death. Sometimes it was deliberate suffering. Captured nobles were stripped naked, paraded through conquered cities, and then subjected to slow symbolic punishment. Some were blinded, others castrated or crippled, not killed, but left alive as living warnings. The message was clear: this is what happens when you resist the Khan. At times, Genghis Khan would spare one or two survivors deliberately, instructing them to return to their homelands. They were not freed as a mercy, but as messengers of fear. Survivors were often forced to watch the execution of loved ones, the burning of their homes, or the torture of their leaders before being sent back. They returned not as heroes, but as broken emissaries, their minds seared with horror. In Herat, it was said that the Mongols forced prisoners to dig their own mass graves, then buried them alive. In Merv, after a brief resistance, nearly 700,000 people were said to be executed, though the real number may have been closer to 200,000. Again, it wasn't just the scale, it was the method. Painful, public, humiliating. A ritual sacrifice performed for maximum visibility. There was a purpose behind the cruelty. Each act of torture, each mutilation or execution served a strategic end: to break morale in the next target city, to fracture alliances, to force surrender before a single Mongol was lost in battle. In many cases, it worked. Cities began to surrender preemptively, opening their gates, offering tribute, swearing loyalty, not out of political agreement, but out of sheer survival-driven terror. The Mongols welcomed this. They didn't want every city to fight. They wanted every city to know what happened to those who did. Even the timing of atrocities was precise. Executions often took place immediately after surrender, but before full looting, to establish dominance. Public punishments were often conducted at dawn, with the entire population forced to watch. And the cruelty was never wasted. It was always witnessed. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Mongol torture was that it wasn't rage. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, practiced, and systematized. Genghis Khan didn't need mass executions to win battles. He used them to win minds. And the result was a form of warfare that attacked not only armies, but civilization's will to exist. This was torture not as punishment, not even as interrogation, but as broadcast, as branding, as legend. And centuries later, the echoes remain, in the ruins scattered across Central Asia, in the written accounts of trembling scribes, and in the collective memory of cultures that were once wiped nearly out of existence. Genghis Khan didn't need everyone to die. He just needed everyone to believe they would. Of all the methods Genghis Khan employed to punish his enemies, few were as symbolic, deliberate, and brutal as death by compression, a slow, suffocating execution carried out by crushing the victim between heavy wooden boards or stones. This was not the chaos of war. It was not the arbitrary killing of a peasant or foot soldier. It was reserved for the high-born, royalty, generals, nobles, those whose deaths carried political and psychological weight. And its message was unmistakable: no blood spilled, but all dignity destroyed. The Mongols, despite their brutality, followed a spiritual logic in some executions. According to certain Mongol and steppe traditions, the spilling of noble blood onto the ground was considered taboo, ritually impure. So when they wanted to kill a high-status enemy, they devised ways to execute without violating that belief. Hence, death by compression, sometimes called smothering beneath the earth. The method varied by region and era, but its core remained the same. The victim was laid flat between two thick wooden planks or stones, and immense weight, often other stones, or even groups of men standing on the boards, was applied until the ribcage collapsed inward, crushing the lungs and heart. It was slow, silent, and horrifyingly intimate. Witnesses described how the condemned would gasp for air, their faces turning purple as bones cracked and organs were compressed. No blade was drawn, no blood was spilled. But death arrived all the same, suffocating, squeezing, final. In some cases, the execution took hours. It was made worse by the ritualistic nature of the act. Crowds were forced to watch. The victims' titles and honors would be read aloud before the execution began, emphasizing how far they had fallen. One of the most notorious examples was the execution of Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, a city in the Khwarezmian Empire. After allowing the massacre of a Mongol trade caravan and allegedly humiliating Genghis Khan's ambassadors by killing them and sewing their heads into sacks, he was captured during the subsequent siege. Genghis Khan didn't order him beheaded or run through with a sword. Instead, Inalchuk was slowly crushed beneath stones, reportedly while his fellow citizens were forced to watch. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a demonstration, a message to all rulers who might contemplate insulting the Khan. This technique was also used when Genghis Khan conquered other royal dynasties. When Mongol forces captured the Jin emperor's family, members of the dynasty were executed by smothering or crushing, especially the male heirs. This wasn't just death, it was erasure, a method of eliminating rival bloodlines without polluting the earth with imperial blood. The act also carried psychological weight. Death by compression denied warriors the clean death they sought. It robbed them of battle, of last words, of visible wounds. It was humiliating and disempowering, transforming kings and generals into silent, gasping victims beneath boards and stones. Mongol chroniclers rarely described these events in emotional terms. For them, it was simply justice, carried out efficiently and in accordance with the needs of empire. But for their enemies, especially those of royal blood, it was the worst possible death, ignoble, excruciating, and deeply symbolic. Even centuries later, the legend of these executions endured in Persian, Chinese, and Middle Eastern texts. Genghis Khan had not merely conquered cities, he had broken ruling lineages, spiritual customs, and psychological barriers. He made it clear that no title, crown, or dynasty could protect you from the weight of his vengeance. Death by the sword could be heroic. Death by crushing was a message, one that said, even kings can be broken. In the cities conquered by Genghis Khan, death was not buried. It was built. After the slaughter came the silence, and after the silence came the pyramid. Towering piles of skulls, stacked methodically outside city gates, beside temples, or in palace courtyards, became a trademark of Mongol conquest. They were not random heaps of corpses. They were architectural warnings, constructed with precision, shaped from the bones of those who dared to resist. In Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh, witnesses reported hills of human remains as high as buildings. Some were arranged geometrically, cones, domes, towers, as if the bones themselves had to serve some symbolic function. Others were used to line roads into the city, forming corridors of skulls through which the few survivors were forced to walk. Each structure served a clear purpose, to speak without words. At Nishapur in 1221, after a Mongol commander, also Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed during the siege, the great Khan ordered every man, woman, and child in the city executed. Persian chroniclers claimed up to 100,000 people were killed, and that the bones of the dead were sorted by category: men in one pile, women in another, children in a third. A tower of bones stood at the center. At Merv, once considered one of the great cities of the Islamic world, the Mongols executed so many people, some estimates say over 200,000, that they ran out of space to bury them. Instead, they built bone mounds that could be seen from miles away. One traveler passing through decades later described the way the sun caught on the weather-whitened skulls like a field of ivory stones. These weren't just remains, they were monuments. The Mongols knew the psychology of conquest. They understood that destruction needed to be visible, ritualized, and unforgettable. A burned city could be rebuilt, but a hill of human skulls, left intact, would haunt the memory of a region for generations. In many cases, captives were forced to build the pyramids themselves, stacking the heads of their own family members before being executed last. It was the final humiliation. Death, delivered not only by steel or fire, but by psychological annihilation. Genghis Khan's generals perfected the practice. Wherever resistance was strong, the pyramids grew taller, and wherever news of them traveled, resistance crumbled. Even centuries later, travelers and scholars recorded the enduring terror of these bone monuments. They were not myth. Archaeological surveys in Central Asia and Iran have uncovered mass graves and bone mounds, matching the locations described in medieval texts. These structures weren't just trophies. They were the foundations of empire. For Genghis Khan, skull pyramids were more than punishment. They were policy, performance, and prophecy. A reminder to all who watched or listened that the throne of the great Khan was not built on gold or law. It was built on bones. Not all torture under Genghis Khan involved blades or burning. Sometimes nature did the killing. In the vast, unforgiving landscapes of Central Asia and Persia, the Mongols turned the terrain itself into an executioner. One of their most psychologically devastating forms of punishment was abandonment, a calculated act in which captives were left to die slowly in the desert. No ropes, no blades, just the wind, the sand, and time. Victims were stripped of clothing, water, or weapons and taken deep into barren land, far from villages, rivers, or even animal tracks. There they were left, alone, disoriented, and exposed. Sometimes their hands were bound. Other times they were left free to wander, pointlessly, fatally, toward a horizon that offered nothing. To die of thirst in the desert is not quick. It is a descent into madness. The tongue swells, the lips crack, and the skin peels in the sun. The mind deteriorates before the body. Hallucinations set in. Victims often staggered in circles, leaving footprints that formed haunting spirals in the sand. The Mongols didn't always watch. They didn't need to. They knew the result. But when the punishment was meant to send a particular message, they did more. In some recorded cases, traitors were buried up to their necks, left to die slowly under the sun, preyed upon by insects, animals, or even their own fear. These men didn't scream. They begged. They whispered apologies to the wind. Sometimes the Mongols would return after several days, not to rescue, but to finish the sentence. If the victim had died, their bones were left as markers. If they clung to life, their throats were cut and their heads left impaled on spears driven deep into the sand. A final warning to those who might cross the Khan. What made abandonment so terrifying wasn't just the death, it was the isolation, the psychological unraveling, the removal of all hope. It turned the victim's own body into a torture chamber, the landscape into an accomplice. In the Mongol Empire, no place was truly safe. But the desert? That was where people went to disappear. The Mongols did not just conquer cities, they consumed them. When Genghis Khan decided a city must fall, not surrender, not be spared, but be obliterated, he unleashed a level of destruction that felt apocalyptic. Fire was not just a weapon, it was a message, a ritual, and a punishment. Mongol siege warfare was efficient. They used engineers, often captured Chinese or Persian specialists, to construct catapults, battering rams, and flaming projectiles. Once inside the walls, the strategy was brutal: slaughter resistance, loot valuables, and then set the city ablaze. But this wasn't limited to structures. People were burned too. In cities like Nishapur, Balkh, and Bamiyan, fires were set while inhabitants were still inside. Entire districts were barricaded, drenched in oil or animal fat, and ignited. Screams echoed through stone alleys as flames spread faster than the victims could flee. There was no warning, no mercy, no exit. Burning alive wasn't collateral damage, it was often intentional. Survivors of Mongol campaigns wrote of men, women, and children being herded into granaries or mosques, then locked inside as torch-bearers circled the building. Fire was set on all sides. Doors were barred shut. The victims inside were reduced to ash and bone, their cries carried on the wind. And sometimes the fire came not at the start, but at the end of the siege. In Bamiyan, after the death of Genghis Khan's grandson at the hands of its defenders, the great Khan ordered the city's total annihilation. According to chroniclers, not a single wall was left standing, and the citizens were burned alive in their homes, with entire families consumed in flame. Bamiyan was erased so completely that it became known as the City of Woe. The Mongols didn't use fire indiscriminately. They used it when they wanted to make a point. The sight of black smoke on the horizon, city after city engulfed, became a signature of Mongol retribution. Travelers and messengers carried these images across Asia and the Middle East like shadows. In rare cases, Mongol commanders would execute traitors or rival leaders by fire, tying them to wooden stakes or platforms, and setting them alight in front of their own soldiers or families. These deaths were slow, theatrical, unforgettable. Fire did more than kill. It erased, it denied burial, it destroyed homes, histories, and sacred spaces. It turned civilization to cinders. And as cities burned, so too did the idea that anything, faith, walls, kings, could withstand the wrath of the Khan. Genghis Khan understood that flames left no body to bury, no structure to rebuild, no symbol to rally behind. What fire didn't consume, fear finished off. In the end, the ash wasn't just what was left behind, it was what they became. Genghis Khan's greatest weapon wasn't his horse. It wasn't the bow. It was fear, cultivated, curated, and unleashed like a plague. Long before the Mongols arrived at a city's walls, they had already begun the battle, not with soldiers, but with stories. Tales of obliterated cities, skull pyramids, mass burnings, and ritual executions raced across trade routes like wildfire. In the minds of those who heard them, the Mongols weren't an army. They were an extinction event. And that's exactly what Genghis Khan wanted. The Mongols engineered fear with the precision of military logistics. Terror wasn't a side effect of conquest. It was part of the plan, a tactic of psychological warfare designed to dismantle resistance before it began. After each massacre or siege, survivors were deliberately spared, sent to nearby cities with gruesome stories of what they had seen. These messengers of fear were not accidental. They were instruments of propaganda. "Resist us," their message said, "and your fate is already written." Mongol armies often sent envoys ahead of their march. They offered surrender and protection, but included explicit warnings. They listed cities that had refused and been wiped from existence. If the terms were rejected, the following assault was not just a military action, it was a performance in terror. The psychological manipulation extended deep into strategy. During sieges, the Mongols sometimes released prisoners deliberately, only to later attack those same cities once they had grown complacent. This unpredictability bred a sense of helplessness among their enemies, paranoia that nowhere was safe, no truce was permanent, no mercy was sincere. Even Mongol battle formations were designed for fear. They would encircle cities, cut off escape, and then wait, letting hunger and anxiety weaken defenders. They used drums, horns, and night attacks to create constant psychological pressure. At times, they tied branches to their horses' tails, kicking up dust to make their armies seem larger than they were, phantoms in the mist. One of the most terrifying tactics was fake retreat. Mongol forces would feign panic and flee, luring enemies out of their strongholds into the open. Once separated from the city, defenders would be surrounded and annihilated. Survivors returned to find their homes already in flames. By the time the real assault came, the enemy was already broken inside. In cities that did not resist, Mongol terms were often honored, initially. Taxes were imposed, local rulers allowed to remain, but even then, the threat lingered just beneath the surface. A missed payment, a whispered insult, an act of defiance, and the flames would return. Genghis Khan also weaponized cultural understanding. He studied the religions, superstitions, and taboos of his enemies, then used them against them. In Islamic cities, he destroyed mosques during prayer times. In Chinese strongholds, he desecrated ancestral tombs. In each case, it wasn't just military victory, it was emotional and spiritual conquest. Fear became a currency. A city that surrendered without a fight could keep its walls. A city that resisted lost everything. As word spread, more cities chose to submit before the first arrow was fired. This saved Genghis Khan resources, men, and time. But it also turned him into something more than a man. He became a myth, an unstoppable force, a name whispered in markets, courts, and temples with the same weight as plague or famine. The greatest empires fall not when their walls are breached, but when their spirit breaks. Genghis Khan understood that. And with every tower of skulls, every screaming city, every sparing of a single terrified survivor, he made sure the fear always got there first. When Genghis Khan conquered an empire, he didn't just kill soldiers, he killed dynasties. The Mongols understood what many conquerors before them had ignored. If you leave the royal children alive, they grow into kings. So they didn't. From the steppes of Central Asia to the palaces of northern China, Genghis Khan's forces sought out not only rulers, but their heirs, the sons, nephews, grandsons of defeated sultans and emperors, and eradicated them in cold, methodical executions. Sometimes the killings were public, other times they were silent and secret. But the goal was always the same: to end a bloodline permanently. In Urgench, a prosperous city of the Khwarezmian Empire, after a prolonged and devastating siege, Mongol soldiers reportedly hunted down members of the royal family, dragging them from hiding places in temples, homes, and underground cisterns. Boys were executed immediately, throats slit or suffocated with cloth. The women were often spared only to be taken as concubines or political tools. At Bamiyan, where a beloved grandson of Genghis Khan was killed in battle, the Khan's response was genocidal. The entire city was not only leveled, it was wiped from record. Chroniclers described how every member of the ruling class, including children, was executed. No tombs, no names, no descendants, just ash and rumor. One of the most haunting strategies involved the crushing of royal heirs, not stabbed or hanged, but suffocated between felt or trampled beneath the hooves of horses. This method adhered to Mongol taboos about spilling noble blood, while ensuring no royal line could ever reclaim power. Even infants were not spared. In Nishapur, after the death of Mongol commander Tokuchar, Genghis Khan reportedly ordered the total extermination of the city's population. That included infants in cradles, some of whom were thrown from towers or burned alive in the arms of their mothers. A message not just to that city, but to any lineage that might dare to rise again. These executions were not just punitive, they were preventative. The Mongols knew that empires didn't rise from steel alone. They rose from memory, from legacy, from surviving blood. By cutting off the next generation, Genghis Khan ensured there would be no future rivals, no sons to avenge fallen kings, no heirs to rally scattered peoples. He was not content to defeat his enemies in life. He wanted to erase their names from history. And so, as the ashes of palaces cooled and the rivers ran red with the last defenders, Mongol officers carried out the final task: find the children and end the line. It was not mercy. It was policy. A cold, calculating reminder that to challenge the Khan did not simply mean death. It meant extinction. The Mongol Empire was a machine, fast, brutal, and precise. But machines break when the gears don't turn. Genghis Khan understood that discipline wasn't a suggestion. It was the spine of empire. To keep the wheels turning, he enforced a code of law so strict, so absolute, that even his most loyal warriors were not immune. That code was called the Yasa. It was unwritten, passed down orally, but known and feared across the empire. It governed everything, from theft and betrayal to battlefield cowardice and disobedience, and its punishments were unforgiving. Even among their own, the Mongols practiced torture as enforcement. The most common punishments were public. A soldier who stole from fellow troops or civilians during unauthorized looting might be stripped, tied to a wooden stake, and beaten with oxtail whips, not once but over days, as an example to others. Flesh peeled, ribs cracked, but the lesson was clear. No one stole under Genghis Khan's watch. Desertion carried a heavier price. Mongol soldiers who fled the battlefield were sometimes dragged behind horses, their bodies bouncing against the steppe until the skin split and bones shattered. Others were tied to poles and left in the elements, starved and exposed until death arrived through frostbite, heat stroke, or wild animals. In especially egregious cases, such as betrayal, sabotage, or failure of command, punishment could take grotesque forms. Mongol records speak of commanders who, after losing battles or failing to execute orders, were boiled alive, skinned, or forced to eat the flesh of their own horses before being executed. Lesser offences had their own punishments. A warrior who fell asleep on guard duty could have his eyelids sewn open and be left facing the sun, a punishment known as the burning stare. Others were tied standing for days without water, arms spread like crucifixes, a silent, agonizing form of psychological torture. The Mongol obsession with discipline even extended to military hierarchy. Entire units were punished for the actions of one man. If a soldier disobeyed orders, 10 of his comrades could be executed alongside him, reinforcing a culture of peer enforcement and paranoia. One of the most feared punishments was known simply as the silence. A disgraced soldier was stripped of his rank, his weapons, and his voice, forbidden to speak, salute, or be acknowledged by his comrades. He marched at the rear of the army, fed only scraps, until either he died or earned death through failure. This was not just isolation, it was social execution. And yet Mongol soldiers followed the yasa not out of fear alone. They believed in it. Because in that brutal system, even the Khan's own blood was not above the law. When one of Genghis Khan's generals disobeyed a direct order and attacked a city prematurely, resulting in heavy Mongol losses, the Khan reportedly executed him personally, despite years of loyalty. It was a clear message. There is no glory in failure, only judgment. Torture in the Mongol ranks wasn't random cruelty, it was discipline with teeth. A system where loyalty was enforced not by trust but by pain, silence, and fear. And it worked, because in the end, the Mongol Empire didn't just destroy its enemies with terror. It terrified itself into obedience. The Mongols killed millions, but a few survived. And they remembered. Their stories, written in trembling hands, passed through oral tradition, buried in forbidden texts, form the final testimony of Genghis Khan's reign of terror. Through them, we glimpse the horror not as statistics, but as lived experience. In 13th century Persia, chronicler Atamalik Juvayni described what he saw at Merv. Once a thriving city, it was transformed into a slaughterhouse. He wrote that 200,000 people were executed in a single week, their corpses choking the streets and water channels. They killed so many, he recorded, that the blood ran like a stream. And Juvayni was one of the lucky ones, spared to tell the tale. Another survivor, the Syrian historian Ibn al-Athir, writing from Mosul, admitted, "I wish I had died before living to see what I have seen." His words captured the despair that followed the Mongol advance, not just from war, but from the annihilation of entire civilizations. In Central Asia, Buddhist monks preserved tales of their temples being burned while they prayed. In China, poets described the sound of galloping hooves, like thunder before the end of the world. One account from northern China told of children being taken from their mothers' arms and thrown into rivers, their cries echoing long after the armies passed. Some Mongol allies, such as the Uyghurs and Tanguts, left records that blurred the line between awe and terror. They admired the Mongols' power, but feared their wrath. One Tangut scribe wrote that Genghis Khan could speak in blood better than in words. The few who were spared, priests, doctors, engineers, were often taken as tools rather than people. They lived, yes, but not freely. One Armenian craftsman, taken from Ani to Karakorum, etched his story into the walls of a monastery decades later. They broke our bodies, but not our hands. But not all accounts were written. Some were carved in scarred landscapes, cities that were never rebuilt, cemeteries filled too quickly to mark graves, and bone fragments, still unearthed by modern archaeologists. These are not metaphors. They are physical evidence. And yet, despite the cruelty, the Mongol Empire didn't vanish in disgrace. It endured, transformed, and eventually became part of the very civilizations it once destroyed. Genghis Khan was mythologized, even glorified. In Mongolia today, he is a national hero. His face appears on currency, his name on vodka bottles. His statue towers 40 meters over the plains he once rode. But to others, the Persians, the Khwarezmians, the Chinese, the Slavs, his legacy remains a wound. Because Mongol cruelty wasn't an aberration. It was a system, a tool of expansion, a science of fear, and the stories that survived are not simply historical records. They are warnings, reminders that civilization can fall, that death can be organized, and that cruelty, when given discipline, law, and purpose, can become empire. As one anonymous scribe in Baghdad wrote decades after the Mongols passed through, "They came from the edge of the world and left the world in ruins." Genghis Khan didn't just build an empire. He built a mechanism of fear, a system that fused speed with savagery, discipline with destruction, and warfare with psychological manipulation. His armies rode like thunder, struck like lightning, and left only silence behind. Not by accident, by design. The torture methods of the Mongol Empire were not scattered acts of cruelty. They were the operating system of conquest, burning cities with their inhabitants still inside, crushing royalty without shedding their blood, tying prisoners to posts and letting the sun or wolves finish them off, using starvation, exposure, and mock mercy to break the will of entire populations. These were not outbursts of rage. They were policy. Even within their own ranks, the Mongols applied these methods, not just to control the conquered, but to control themselves. Betray the code? Beaten? Disobey the Khan? Executed. Fail your commander? Erased. No exceptions. No second chances. And that's why it worked. This machinery of terror allowed Genghis Khan to do what no warlord had done before. Unite the Mongol tribes, shatter the Khwarezmian Empire, conquer Persia, Russia, China, establish the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, not through diplomacy, not through culture, but through calculated, relentless, industrialized violence. And still, there's a paradox. Genghis Khan was not a mindless butcher. He was a strategist, a lawmaker. In his wake, trade routes flourished, cities were rebuilt, religions were protected, if they submitted. Order followed annihilation. In that sense, the terror was a means to stability, a horror that made room for peace. But the cost? Tens of millions dead, cultures lost, languages erased, and the rise of a legacy that still divides historians to this day. To some, Genghis Khan was a genius of statecraft. To others, a war criminal on horseback. But what cannot be denied is this. He understood the anatomy of fear better than anyone before or since. He wielded it not like a sword, but like a scalpel. Precise, repeating, unforgiving. And in that dark genius, he redefined what it meant to rule. Not through loyalty, but through obedience bought with blood. Even now, centuries later, we dig up the bones, we read the chronicles, we stare into the steppes and wonder, how did it happen? How did one man ignite such a blaze across half the earth? The answer is simple. He built a system where fear was the fuel. And as long as the world burns, Genghis Khan's shadow still rides on the wind.